I'll never forget the sound. It was a faint tap 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 against the hull, somewhere below my feet. At first, I thought it was just loose gear rattling in the cabin. But when you're strapped into a machine that's never flown before, and you're going 17,000 miles per hour, every sound feels like a death sentence. "Crip, you hear that?" I asked. Bob Crippen craned his neck, scanning the panels, then shrugged. "Yeah. Could be anything." But it wasn't anything. It was the sound of Columbia's heat shield tiles, the only thing standing between us and a fiery death, breaking off in flight. The crazy part? Nobody knew how many we'd lost, or where. If the damage was on the belly, we were cooked. Literally. I kept running the scenario in my head: we'd hit atmosphere on re-entry, plasma would rush under the missing tiles, and Columbia would turn into a blowtorch with us inside. And there wasn't a damn thing we could do about it. We were flying a winged coffin, and the funeral was scheduled for landing day. The first hours after reaching orbit were supposed to be the relax and breathe phase, the time when you shake off the brutal launch and settle into the routine. Instead, Bob and I were both leaning forward in our seats, checking the instruments and listening for noises that didn't belong. It is hard to explain how much of spaceflight in those days came down to sound and feel. The panels lit up with numbers and warnings, but your body often told you faster when something was wrong. And both of us had felt the vibration during ascent. "Look at this," Bob said, pointing at a line in the system's display. The telemetry was normal, but neither of us trusted normal that day. We knew that Columbia was covered in more than 30,000 black and white tiles, each one hand-glued, each one fragile. We also knew they had fallen off during ground tests when engineers sprayed them with a garden hose. So when we heard the clinking sound against the fuselage, the first thought that crossed my mind was not imagination. It was tiles. We radioed down to Houston. "Columbia, this is Houston. Go ahead." "Houston, we're hearing some unusual noise, sounds like debris striking the hull. Request you take a look from the tracking cameras if you've got anything on ascent," I said. There was a pause. Too long a pause. Finally, the Capcom came back: "Columbia, we copy. We'll check what we have." The pause told us everything. If they had a clear camera angle, they would have reassured us right away. Instead, they were scrambling. Bob leaned back, exhaling hard. "If it's tiles, and they're off the bottom, we're dead." I didn't answer. Not because I disagreed, but because I couldn't let myself say it out loud. There was no way to check the underside of the orbiter. No mirrors, no cameras, nothing. We were flying blind. A few orbits later, Houston called again. "Columbia, we don't have complete imaging on the belly. We did see some white material separate during ascent. Could be ice from the external tank. Could be tiles. We're continuing to assess." Bob looked at me with raised eyebrows. "That's NASA speak for, we don't know jack." He was right. Ice shedding from the external tank was normal, but ice didn't make a metallic tapping sound as it hit structure. We kept replaying the noise in our heads. The uncertainty was worse than confirmation. I started going through the re-entry checklist in my mind, trying to imagine what would happen if the belly was scarred. We would roll into the atmosphere over the Indian Ocean, nose angled high, wings shaking from turbulence, and if hot plasma found an opening, it would tear through the structure in seconds. The orbiter would disintegrate and we would not even have time to register it. The difference between returning as heroes or never returning at all came down to whether a few fragile tiles had stayed attached. The hours dragged. We performed system checks, ran small experiments, and tried to act normal. But every few minutes, one of us would glance at the panels or the windows, waiting for a sign. The cockpit smelled of plastic, machine oil, and the faint tang of burnt propellant still trapped in the ventilation. Every sound was amplified by the silence of space. You felt like the ship was breathing with you. At one point, Bob broke the quiet. "You know, if we don't make it back, they'll still call this a successful test. They'll say, well, we learned what we needed. I stared at him. That's the most comforting thing you could have said. He smirked, but there was no humor in his eyes. He was younger than me, on his first flight. I had been in space 4 times before, but this one felt different. On Apollo, at least, we had escape options. The shuttle had none. When the next compass opened, I pressed again. Houston, any better look at the underside? Columbia, negative. We're working every angle. At this time we have no evidence of critical damage. I looked at Bob and mouthed the words, at this time. That was all we needed to hear. The real weight of it hit me then. We were not going to know until the end. We would live the next 2 days doing experiments, moving through the flight plan, smiling for cameras, all while carrying the possibility that re-entry was going to kill us. It was a strange kind of limbo. You cannot prepare for it in training. You simply carry it with you. When the compass closed again, Bob floated closer, anchoring himself on the console with his toes. His voice dropped. So what do you think, John? Be honest. I rubbed my temples. I think we're flying a test article. First time. No unmanned flight. Everyone on the ground knows there are risks they didn't tell us. I think some tiles are gone. The question is where? And if they're on the belly? I looked at him directly. Then we burn. We let that hang in the air, the quiet of the cabin filling the space between us. There was nothing left to say at that moment. Both of us knew it, both of us accepted it, but neither of us wanted to give it more power by speaking further. That night, if you can call it night in orbit, I strapped myself into the sleep restraint and stared at the wall. Sleep would not come. I kept hearing the faint tapping sound from ascent, over and over, and I kept seeing in my mind the fiery glow of plasma tearing at the shuttle's skin. We had volunteered for this, both of us, but the weight of that choice pressed hard in the quiet. The following morning, or what passed for morning in orbit, we had another long compass with Houston. Both Bob and I were strapped in, floating against the consoles, waiting for the voices from the ground. They started with routine updates, lists of experiments to perform, and camera operations. It felt like small talk before the real subject, and I grew restless. Finally I cut in, sharper than usual. Houston, this is Columbia. We need an update on tile assessment. Any new imagery? There was silence, then Capcom's voice came back, careful and even. Columbia, negative improvement. We've reviewed ascent footage, still inconclusive on lower surface condition. Recommend continue nominal operations. I could hear the choice of words. Negative improvement. Inconclusive. Nominal. They were circling around the same point. Nobody could tell us if our heat shield was intact. We were running blind. Bob floated back from the panel and gave me a look that said exactly what I was thinking. They were stalling. After the compass ended, he muttered, they don't want to say it because they don't know. We're test pilots, John, but this is the first time I've felt like the test is being run on us instead of the machine. I nodded. You're not wrong. They didn't put a camera under this bird, no way to check. So it's our necks until we hit air again. The reality sank deeper with each orbit. We were performing scheduled experiments, photographing Earth, and even checking the remote manipulator arm. All of it was busy work, because both of us knew that the mission was going to be defined by the heat shield. Every task was done with the knowledge that it could be meaningless if the underside was torn apart. The rhythm of switching circuits and recording data felt mechanical, but behind it ran a constant calculation, 2 days until re-entry, 2 days to wonder if this would be our last orbit. We started confronting it out loud. Suppose it's the wing tiles, Bob said quietly during a meal break. Think there's any chance of riding through? I shook my head. Wings take full heating loads during peak re-entry. Lose a tile there, structure fails. That's it. And if it's the belly? Same outcome, just faster. Plasma penetrates, burns through aluminum, we break apart. No ejection seats, no bailout. Nothing. He didn't answer for a while. He just floated in the cabin, looking out the small window at the curved earth below us. The planet looked calm and bright, but the silence in our cockpit was heavy. The next calm pass brought more of the same. Columbia, analysis continues. We are not observing evidence of catastrophic damage. Advise proceed with mission timeline. I keyed the mic again, pressing harder. Houston, clarify. Are you stating definitively no catastrophic damage, or stating absence of evidence only? A longer pause than usual. Columbia, we cannot confirm condition of all tile surfaces. We are stating absence of evidence. Repeat, absence of evidence. Bob leaned over to me and whispered, that's lawyer talk. Means we're screwed if it's bad. I muted the loop and faced him. We knew when we climbed in. This was never going to be a risk-free flight. The bird is experimental. First time. If we're lucky, we walk away. If not, we'll be the footnote that proves they needed an unmanned test first. He frowned but didn't argue. We both knew that was the truth. Through the day, our conversations with Houston grew more tense. I kept returning to the same demand, confirmation of underside imagery. Each time they answered with the same guarded phrases. They were trying to keep us focused, to prevent distraction. But the more they spoke like that, the more obvious it became that nobody had real answers. At one point Bob snapped. Houston, with respect, we're the ones strapped in up here. If you have uncertainty, don't downplay it. We need clear language. The Capcom came back, a little firmer. Columbia, copy. We do not have definitive visual confirmation of tile condition. Repeat, no definitive confirmation. Recommend continue flight plan. Bob clicked off the mic and muttered, that's as close as they'll get to saying, you're on your own. The cockpit atmosphere turned more charged after that. We both went through the motions, but there was no hiding the tension. Even small system checks felt loaded. I found myself double and triple verifying switches, not because I expected them to fail but because it gave me something to control. The worst part was the lack of options. With Apollo, you could improvise, you could use checklists as a guide and then invent when things broke. Here, we were reduced to passengers, waiting for re-entry to prove us right or wrong. Later, off-comm, Bob asked quietly, you ever regret pushing for shuttle over Apollo applications? I thought about it. Regret? No. Somebody had to fly it. But I don't like that we're the first crew without a test before us. That decision wasn't ours. We're paying for it. He nodded. Neither of us said what we were both thinking, that we might be the payment itself. As the second day wore on, the confrontation shifted from Houston to ourselves. We had asked every question, pressed every angle, and still we were no closer to certainty. The final confrontation was internal. We had to accept that the condition of the underside was unknown and unchangeable. What remained was to fly the mission as if landing was guaranteed, even though both of us knew it was a gamble. That night, I strapped into the restraint again. I closed my eyes, but sleep came only in short bursts. I kept replaying the conversation with Houston, the evasive phrasing, the pauses before answers. I wondered if they already suspected damage but were withholding it. Or if, like us, they were just waiting for the final proof that would only come when Columbia hit the upper atmosphere. I knew then that this was the confrontation we would live with until wheels stopped, the tension between carrying out a mission as if it was normal, and facing privately that it could end in fire. There was no resolution that night, only the heavy weight of uncertainty pressing on every breath. On flight day 3 the mission tempo shifted. Up to that point we had been running experiments and checking systems, but as the return drew closer the procedures for deorbit and landing began to take over our schedules. Normally this stage would bring a sense of routine, almost a rhythm, but with the unknown status of the heat shield, every checklist item felt like setting the stage for either survival or the end. Houston started feeding us detailed re-entry procedures early, with a tone that was steadier than before, almost rehearsed. Columbia, this is Houston. We'll begin review of the deorbit burn checklist. Stand by for uplink. The instructions scrolled in, lines of data for guidance targets, burn duration, and contingency items. I read each one carefully, making sure there was no hidden signal between the lines, no subtle hint that they expected us not to make it. Bob went through the guidance computer entries while I verified the numbers against my checklist. He called out each parameter, and I confirmed them, both of us repeating them twice. It was pure procedure, yet beneath the formality ran an undercurrent of tension neither of us voiced. We were preparing Columbia to commit to a path that could not be undone. Once the deorbit burn started, there was no way back to orbit. During a quiet moment, Bob asked the question both of us had been carrying. "John, if we light the OMS engines and something is wrong with the belly, that's it. No way to stop it. You still comfortable with this?" I looked at him directly. "There's no alternative. We can't stay up here. Supplies run out, orbit decays. Only option is down. The only choice we have is whether we do our jobs right until the last second. That's the way it is." He nodded slowly, then returned to the panel. He knew I was right. Both of us did. The hours leading up to deorbit became a mixture of mechanical tasks and heavy silence. We packed away equipment, secured loose items, and stowed data recorders. Every movement was deliberate. I could sense Bob's tension in the way he checked straps twice, in the way he lingered at switches before pressing them. I was the same. The cockpit that had been noisy and filled with conversation the first day was now subdued, voices low and words fewer. Houston remained calm, steady, and consistent. "Columbia, systems look good. Recommend continue timeline. We see no anomalies." Their words carried authority, but I had flown long enough to know when people were speaking with confidence and when they were holding back. There was no malice in it, only the reality that nobody could give us certainty. Before the burn, I took a moment to float by the window. Earth stretched out below, a broad horizon with faint atmospheric haze. It was beautiful, but I wasn't admiring it. I was measuring it. That thin blue line was what would either save us or consume us. I strapped back into my seat and checked my restraints 3 times. Bob broke the silence. "You ever think we should have refused this flight, made them fly it unmanned first?" I thought about it. Wouldn't have mattered. Someone had to be first. We're here because we said yes. You can't second guess it now. He let out a breath and nodded. "Guess so." When the time came, the final go for the deorbit burn came through the loop. "Columbia, you are go for deorbit. Burn duration 2 minutes 38 seconds. I keyed the mic, Columbia copies. Go for deorbit." We executed the burn, the engines firing behind us, pressing us lightly into the restraints. The numbers ticked down on the guidance display, and I called out the seconds. Bob monitored the attitude carefully, making minor corrections with the RCS thrusters. The burn completed right on target, and we were committed. The moment the engines shut down, the line was crossed. Our orbit began to decay, and we were falling whether the tiles held or not. The checklist rolled on. Configuring hydraulic systems, verifying APU start sequences, arming the flight control surfaces. Each step was precise, controlled, practiced hundreds of times in simulators. But the difference was that in Houston's simulators the assumption was always that the vehicle was intact. Here, in the Real Columbia, we carried the unknown with us. I could sense Bob watching me as much as he was watching the instruments. At one point he said quietly, "If we don't walk away from this, it's been an honor." I looked over at him. "We're not done yet. Keep flying the bird." He gave a short nod and returned to his panel. It wasn't bravado. It was focus. As long as we were alive, the only task was to keep flying. The atmosphere came up fast. The nose angled up, the wings took the first bite of air, and the shuttle began to shudder. The vibrations grew, and the cockpit filled with the sound of rushing air against the skin. Both of us watched the temperature gauges rise, the heating rates climbing as we pushed deeper. Every number was loaded with meaning. If there was a breach, one of those gauges would spike, and the flight would end there. "Temperature's holding," Bob called out, voice tight. "Copy," I answered, eyes fixed on the panels. The G-forces built slowly, pressing us into our seats. The plasma glow outside the windows painted the cockpit in faint light, flickering as Columbia rode through the high atmosphere. Still the numbers held, still the tiles seemed to be doing their job. But until we reached the lower layers and slowed, neither of us believed it was certain. The minutes stretched. Vibrations shook the cabin harder. I kept one hand near the manual controls, ready to take over if the autopilot faltered. Bob called out data points at regular intervals, his voice clipped but steady. Both of us were riding the thin line between procedure and raw survival, knowing there was nothing left to change, nothing left to repair, only to endure the descent and hope the ship was whole. The cabin shook harder as Columbia dropped into thicker air. The guidance computer was flying the programmed entry profile, rolling us left and right to bleed off speed, but even though I trusted the system, my hands hovered close to the rotational hand controller. The temperatures outside were at their peak. Gauges showed thousands of degrees on the skin. We could hear faint creaks and pops from the structure as the air clawed at the orbiter. Neither of us said it aloud, but both of us knew this was the phase that would decide everything. Bob broke the silence first. "Temps holding steady. No asymmetry yet." His voice was clipped, precise, but his eyes flicked toward me for a moment longer than necessary. "Copy," I answered. I wanted to keep it businesslike, but the strain was obvious in the way my jaw clenched around the words. Minutes crawled by. I watched the total energy readout, tracking how much velocity we had bled off, and compared it to our altitude. The numbers were good, right on profile. That was reassuring, but it didn't silence the question in my head. If there were tiles missing, this was when we would find out. The only evidence we had was that nothing catastrophic had happened yet. When the next role reversal started, the orbiter shook violently, and a brief static hiss came over the comm. Bob immediately looked up. "You see that spike?" I checked the panel. One of the temperature sensors on the right wing had jumped slightly higher than expected before stabilizing. I keyed the mic. "Houston, Columbia. We saw a thermal spike on right wing, now returning nominal. Confirm you see the same." There was a pause. "Columbia, Houston. We see it. Data is stable now. Recommend continue profile." "Copy," I said, but inside I didn't like the way they had worded it. Recommend continue profile. As if we had a choice. The reality was that we had no abort mode. We were committed until either the landing strip appeared under us or the ship came apart. Bob looked straight ahead, hands tight on the checklist. If that spike meant a breach, we wouldn't even have time to say anything before it got us. "Keep flying," I told him. It came out harsher than I intended, but it was the only thing to say. He nodded, eyes back on the panel. We fell into silence again, broken only by the calls to Houston and the occasional checklist confirmations. But behind that silence, something shifted. I could feel the weight of the conversation we hadn't had yet pressing at both of us. The possibility that this could end badly had been there since ascent, but now, with Earth's surface rushing up to meet us, it was time to acknowledge it directly. Bob was the one who finally spoke. "John, if we don't make it, I want to say thanks. You've been steady through all of this. I couldn't have asked for a better commander on my first flight." I looked at him, studying the tight line of his mouth, the way his eyes didn't leave the instruments. "You're doing your job as well as anyone could. Whatever happens, you've proven yourself up here." He gave a small nod. Still, if this is it, I'm glad I'm with someone who's been through it all before. I thought about my answer before I spoke. I've flown a lot of missions, Bob, but I've never flown anything like this. Nobody has. The truth is, we're both in uncharted territory. And if it comes down to it, people will remember we took the first step. For a moment, the cockpit was quiet except for the shudder of the airframe. Then Bob said softly, "You think they'll ever tell us the full truth? About how much they knew before launch, about the risks?" I didn't hesitate. No. They'll manage the story. They'll talk about progress, about success, about lessons learned. That's how it always goes. The details get buried in technical reports. But between us, we know the reality. He smiled faintly at that, a tired smile, then returned his focus to the descent. As we dropped below 150,000 feet, the G-forces grew heavier. It pressed us deeper into the seats, our bodies straining against the harnesses. My arms grew stiff from the constant pressure, and I could hear Bob's breathing over the intercom, slightly faster but controlled. We continued trading short confirmations with Houston, but in between those words, there was a rhythm between the two of us, unspoken understanding that this was the final stretch. "Approach corridor locked," Bob said. "Copy." "Good track," I confirmed. The temperatures began to taper as we slowed. The fiery glow outside dimmed, and the buffeting eased slightly. We were through the worst of the heating. Both of us knew it, but we didn't celebrate. We didn't even acknowledge it. We kept watching the instruments, waiting for the next problem to appear. Finally Bob said in a quieter voice, "If we do make it, you know people will act like it was all smooth, like the shuttle was solid from day one. They'll never know what it was like in here," I answered. "But that's the job. We take the risk so they don't have to think about it." The descent continued, each mile bringing us closer to Edwards Air Force Base. The long lakebed runway stretched across the desert, invisible at first but soon visible through the haze. Seeing it should have felt like relief, but I held on to caution. Until the wheels touched and stopped, nothing was guaranteed. Bob glanced at me again, and his expression softened for the first time since the mission began. "If we put her down in one piece, John, drinks are on me." I allowed myself the smallest grin. "I'll hold you to that." We turned back to the task at hand. The last conversation between us had been said, the thanks given, the doubts admitted. Now all that was left was to land the machine and see if fortune favored us this time. The desert runway stretched wide in front of us, and as Columbia's wheels touched the lakebed, the cockpit filled with a long scraping roar that was the most welcome sound of my career. I held the nose off as long as I could, then eased it down, letting the front wheel make contact. Dust billowed on both sides as we rolled, and gradually the vibration settled into a steady rumble before tapering into silence. The shuttle slowed to a crawl, and then to a full stop. For a moment neither of us moved. We just sat there, strapped in, breathing the hot air inside the cabin and listening to the ticking of metal cooling around us. "Columbia, wheels stopped," I called into the mic. The words felt heavier than any I had spoken before. Houston responded immediately, "Copy, Columbia. Wheels stopped. Congratulations. Welcome home." The cheer behind the Capcom's voice was obvious. I looked over at Bob. His shoulders had sagged with relief, and he finally let out the long breath he had been holding. I realized I had been holding one too. We started the power-down procedures, flipping switches and shutting down systems. Everything was by the book, every step the same as training, but it carried a weight that no simulator could replicate. We were doing these steps in a vehicle that had just proven itself, but also in one that had nearly killed us, and we both knew it. As we went through the motions, my thoughts kept circling back to the unanswered question: how many tiles had we lost, and how close had we been to not walking away? The crew hatch opened at last, and the hot desert air rushed in, mixed with the faint smell of dust and fuel. Stepping out onto the stairs, I squinted against the bright California sun. The ground team was there, waving, smiling, applauding, and the crowd in the distance was cheering. For the cameras it was triumph, the beginning of a new era of reusable spacecraft, the proof that the shuttle could fly and land like an airplane. I raised my hand and waved, because that was the job. But inside, I was still thinking about that faint tapping noise during ascent, and the spike on the wing sensor during entry. Later, when the technicians inspected Columbia, they confirmed what we had feared. Tiles had been lost. Some areas had been gouged, leaving bare patches. None of the missing tiles had exposed a critical section of the belly or the wings, but it had been a close call. Too close. We had flown through luck as much as engineering. Bob and I both knew that if the damage had been just a little worse, we would not have made it back. That night, after the debriefings and the press conferences, I finally had a chance to sit quietly in a small room at Edwards. I replayed the mission in my head, from the roar of the boosters to the long silence after we'll stop. The more I thought about it, the more clear it became that what had been celebrated publicly as a triumph had also been a warning. The shuttle could fly, but it was fragile. We had proven the concept, but at the same time we had revealed the danger hidden beneath the glossy promise of reusability. Bob came in and sat across from me. He looked exhausted, but there was also a spark in his eyes. "Hell of a first flight," he said. "Hell of a risk," I answered. He leaned back. "You think they'll listen to the warnings? About the tiles, about skipping unmanned tests?" I shook my head slowly. "They'll push forward. They'll argue that it worked, so it can work again. Success has a way of erasing the doubts. But we know better." He didn't argue. We both sat in silence for a long time. In the weeks that followed, I kept hearing the same phrases repeated by officials: historic success, new era, flawless landing. They weren't lies, not exactly, but they left out the reality of what it felt like inside Columbia during those 3 days. They left out the fact that we had lived with the possibility of burning up on re-entry, and that the only reason we didn't was because the damage had been on the edges rather than the core. To the public, STS-1 became a story of victory. To those of us who flew it, it was also a reminder that triumph and disaster can ride in the same spacecraft. When I think back on it now, what stays with me most is not the applause on the runway or the photographs that appeared in newspapers. What stays with me is the quiet inside the cockpit during those long orbits, when Bob and I were floating in our seats, knowing there was nothing left to check, nothing left to fix, only the waiting to see if the machine would hold together. That quiet weighed more than the roar of launch or the rumble of landing. I sometimes wonder what would have happened if we had lost Columbia on that first flight. The shuttle program might have been cancelled, or it might have been pushed ahead even harder, depending on which voices carried the most weight. But we survived, and because we survived, the program continued. In that sense, our survival shaped the future, for better and worse. Looking back, I do not regret flying STS-1. It was the assignment of a lifetime, and I would have accepted it again even knowing the risks. But I never forgot how close we came, and I never let myself believe that the shuttle was as safe as it was often portrayed. I carried that knowledge into every mission that followed, into every conversation with engineers, and into every word of caution I gave younger astronauts. The landing of Columbia on April 14, 1981, was a milestone, but it was also a message. Spaceflight would never be routine, no matter how often we flew. Every mission carried risk, and the only honest way to face it was to acknowledge it fully. That was the lesson I took from STS-1, and it stayed with me for the rest of my career.